I'm so excited to have Veronica Benavides on the podcast. Well, she will talk about the Language Preservation Podcast. Veronica, bienvenidos.
Muchas gracias por tenerme aquí. Es un placer.
El placer es
Happy to
mío.
be here. Thank you.
Can you please start off with telling us how you spend your days, where you spend your days, and what is your proudest professional achievement?
So, how do I spend my days? Well, I spend my days in Copenhagen mostly. That's kind of the home base for me. So, I wake up and try to start with a slow morning. I'm greeted by my two loud trilingual children and take them to school and then kind of engage in my work day. And I work both here in Copenhagen and also in the US. Most of our work is actually based in the US. And our core work, the Language Preservation Project, works with families and educators to help them to cultivate heritage languages. So, this really came from my experience as a heritage language speaker, someone who had Spanish in their family, but through the generations, it was lost. And I really saw how that was discouraged by schools, how it was not cultivated in school settings, and then how that had affected the decisions that my parents made. And then I became an educator, got my doctorate in education, and saw that more than 33% of students enter into school settings speaking their home language, but less than 16% graduate with biliteracy or fluency in those languages. And so there's some major disconnect happening there. And it can be seen across many different points that we could get into, but that then became my life's work, to reclaim my own heritage language and then to try to change the ecosystem within communities that would allow for students to maintain connections to their languages and cultures because of the many benefits that come with that. So that's what I work on mostly during the day. And then I pick up my crazy kids from school. We have a lovely dinner time together, put them to bed. And then usually back online a couple nights a week because I work across time zones, and then try to get in bed by 10 a.m. if possible, so that I can get my full 8 hours of sleep.
Can you tell us a story about teaching that has changed your practice?
Yeah, a story about teaching that has changed my practice. Well, I became a teacher straight out of undergrad. I was getting my master's at the same time while I was teaching in New York City. And I was very much like a Texas girl. New York City was like a, big new world to me. So I feel like I was learning a lot while going to be a teacher as well. And I was learning a lot of cultural differences as well. So I was teaching high school, ninth and 10th graders, social studies. And I was teaching in a very diverse school in the Lower East Side of Manhattan that had Dominican students, Puerto Rican students, students from Thailand and China and Mexico and African Americans, and like lots of different identities that were there. A very large Spanish speaking population from many different countries. And I remember in one of the classes that I was in, I kind of heard like a scuffle in the back of the class. And I went up to the students to say, like, hey, what's going on? And one of the students said, well, he called me a Mexican, miss. And I said, well, what's wrong with being called a Mexican? And he said, well, I'm not Mexican. Mexicans are like ugly and dirty. And I said, okay, like very shocked, and said, well, I'm Mexican. And they were like, no, you're not Mexican, miss. Like, you don't like look like a Mexican or this or that. And so it was the first time, number one, that I had really heard stereotypes about Mexicans, like outside of TV. Like I had seen that as a kid growing up on like, outside of the narrative, but most of the community that I was with was like Mexican or Salvadorian. And so I hadn't really experienced those types of stereotypes like directly in my community. And it really was a thing in this school that there was like a hierarchy of Latinidad, like which Latinos were the good Latinos and which Latinos like were not the good Latinos. And this showed up in that, in that class in that moment. And we had a discussion as a class. We talked about it. But it was still there. It kind of popped up in different instances. There was a Spanish class that was being taught, and all the students were being complaining about being assigned Mexico. Like they didn't want to be assigned Mexico as a country to study because they thought that it was not good or not cool. And so the teacher just took Mexico off of the country study list because none of the kids wanted it. And I remember going up to the principal and saying, you can't just erase this culture or identity from the curriculum because kids are complaining about it. Like, this is something that you need to lean into and talk about. So I actually, a year or so later, ended up creating a course called Movement Makers that was focusing on like ethnic studies and focusing on different cultures and really having students dive into those conversations, not from a place of like shame, you shouldn't be doing this, right? Because students were just reflecting back what they've been absorbing, but then allowing them a different perspective to understand different cultural identities and differences and to approach it from a place of curiosity and appreciation rather than fear or hate. So that was, a real formative moment for me.
It makes me think, like, where did that child get that idea of like, don't call me Mexican? And it'd be worse if that child was Mexican and didn't want to identify as like that internalized racism. I spent some time in Argentina, and I could see people saying, "Oh, you're gonna love Argentina. It's like the Europe of Latin America." And before then, I was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds real fun." And I'm like, wait a minute, why are we saying it Argentina being like, it sounded like the best place to be in Latin America because it's so close associated to Europe. I'm like, doesn't that mean that they lose their Latin Americanness because they're so European? I thought that was funny.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I think working so much right now with a lot of Latinx families and educators is something that we need to dive into of like, what are the images that we are showing our children around Latinidad? And is it centering, what we would see on telenovelas that are like white European Latino people that are like not representative of what our community actually looks like, where we come from. And so it's really beginning to see it, question it, interrogate it, and then start to change it. And so yeah, I think there's also a lot of work to even look at like bilingual materials. So it's not just happening in our media in terms of, TV, what we're seeing, but it also happens in terms of if we're trying to pass on the Spanish language to our children, there's also a lot of lack of diversity in the materials and like an aspiration towards whiteness or Europeanness that is a legacy of colonialism that you can see in materials that hopefully we're starting to shift. And that's a part of what we're trying to do at the Language Preservation Project as well.
Well, we'll get to that soon. Let's first talk about, actually, you used the term heritage language, and that's what I use. I used to use home language, and now I use heritage language. I would love for your perspective. Why did you intentionally use heritage language?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I think it's so hard to find the right term, right? Because home language, it feels a little bit more intuitive. It's like, oh, it's the language of the home, but it's not always the language of the home, right? It could be the language of the grandparents' home. It's as heritage language is essentially the language that comes from your culture, the language that comes from your grandparents or great grandparents, and it could have been lost at any point along the generations or preserved. We all have different relationships to our heritage languages. The term that we also like to use at the Language Preservation Project is bilingualism, children with bilingualism in their bones, meaning that they have like the foundations for bilingualism, that they have a cultural connection to the language, that they've grown up hearing the language, that they speak some of the language in some capacity. And what we really want to do is provide environments that cultivate and catalyze that language development.
Yeah, that is so important. The ability to maintain the student's heritage language. And it's not just at home. Actually, I still remember a teacher saying, notice this is an English speaking school and your home language should be spoken at home. And that's when I started realizing like, oh, we should change that because it creates a location centered, it creates language, it pins language to the location, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then that dichotomy, that separation of language in school or home in school starts because we start labeling things as home language.
I hadn't thought of that. I think that's really important. I also thought in terms of home language that some children don't hear their heritage language in the home because maybe it was lost a generation before, yet it's still something that they have a connection to and a right to reclaim. And I also think heritage language is a different language learning process than just learning a second language, because there's so much history and so much like familial connections and traumas and all of these things that are tied up with the language, that when you're learning it, you may experience a different level of shame or anxiety or different relationships around the language than you would to another language that you're not connected to at all.
Well, let's jump into talking about your podcast, which is called Talking to Grandma. It focuses on
Mm-hmm.
language, heritage, and culture preservation. How did you come up with that name and what does it mean?
Yeah. So talking to grandma came to me because I wanted to have conversations with folks who were preserving their heritage languages in the classrooms, in homes, or even studying it in academia. So we have all these different perspectives there. And my journey with my heritage language really comes back to my grandma because I couldn't speak to her growing up. She only spoke Spanish and I only spoke English. And so this, relationship, it was my only living, it is my only living grandparent, the only grandparent I've ever known. And she carries so much history and culture and stories there. And we just had this very kind of superficial relationship for a long time because I didn't speak Spanish. And it wasn't until I became an adult, learned the language, was able to connect with her, that this whole world opened up, that I was able to learn these familial stories. I didn't know that I had that my grandmother had a whole nother child that died at infancy that I never knew about because I couldn't talk to her about it. And once I could talk to her, I learned about that experience, that story. I learned about her relationships. I learned about her history, her journeys from, Guanajuato to Reynosa to, Donna, Texas, all these different parts of her story. And I think that relationship really exemplified what language can do for people, how it keeps us connected to our stories and our community and our culture. So we wanted to call it Talking to Grandma because of that, because it helps people, their heritage languages help them stay connected to their families and their histories and their stories. And also because most heritage languages are lost by the second or third generation. So my story isn't very uncommon. There are lots of people who are growing up in the US who cannot speak or communicate fully with their grandparents because their heritage language has been lost. So we really wanted to kind of elevate the ability to be able to reclaim and reconnect with that part of our lives.
When you talked about your grandma, I'm thinking about my nieces and my nephews because they have a very superficial relationship with their grandmother as well. They can understand Vietnamese when spoken to, but they prefer to respond to grandma in English. And so grandma can
Mm-hmm.
only ask for a few things or can don't really talk about their lives, my nieces and nephew lives, like how are you, have you eaten, how's school, and that's it. But there are these like deep conversations that I'm hearing my sister have with my nieces and my nephews. I'm like, oh, these are the things that's lost, and I'm thinking about the things that they don't understand about grandma because they don't have the language um, to engage with her. It reminds me of the quote that the limits of our language are the limits of our world.
And that was very much my experience. And I didn't know really what I was losing until I learned the language and saw all of these elements of story and family and history. And so I think a part of our work also with families, when helping them to figure out how to pass on their heritage languages to their children, is to clearly communicate to children what's the benefits of having that heritage language. How could their lives be enriched by being able to communicate in that heritage language?
Can you paint for us a picture? What did that look like when you had a superficial relationship with your grandmother before you learned Spanish?
Very similar to what you communicated. Like, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. Yes, no. I mean, we understood a lot more. I think a lot of my journey and my bilingualism has been to accept that I was like passively bilingual, right? And that even that set the foundation for me being able to acquire the language much faster. And so hearing Spanish, I definitely knew all of the language and phrases, like when I was in trouble or when I wasn't supposed to touch something, or like, direct commands type of stuff. Um, so I would say that it was very much like she wasn't a super active presence or role, because we couldn't go deeper beyond that. But she talked a lot. She had so many stories. She was super talkative. And I just remember she would always be at the kitchen table with my mom, just talking, 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 talking. And I would tune it out because I really kind of only understood like the direct commands that were, said to me, basic things. And so I remember just not understanding when they were talking a lot, and tuning that out. And I remember when I learned the language, it was like this light bulb went off because I could hear them talking. And I was like, oh my God, I understand what they're saying. Like, I know what's going on here. And I remember that moment of being allowed kind of like entry into this space and these stories because I could understand. She's still very talkative. Um, well into her 90s with dementia, and like will talk your ear off. Same story over and over, but she has plenty of stories to go around. Mhm.
Will you tell me about how your relationship with your grandmother changed? Like that one moment where you're like, you used to have this conversation, but then it like, where she brought you into her life, or you brought her into your life because of because you have more Spanish.
I remember so my Spanish started getting better about like a year before I decided to go to Mexico, like to go back to Mexico, to live there as a young adult, because I also just wanted to like be immersed to learn the language even more. And so I would call her, because I called my mom and I was like, Mom, I need to practice Spanish more. And my mom, having grown up speaking Spanish, it's her first language, also felt like uncomfortable talking to me in Spanish. She was like, I don't know, it's easier in English. Like she didn't want to deal with having to talk to me in Spanish. So she was like, call your grandma. So I called my grandma pretty frequently leading up to those, trips to Mexico. And I think, just the relationship changed in that my grandma, like I said, loves to talk. So she would just tell me about all these stories about like when she was younger and what her mom was like. And, when she moved to up to like the northern part of Mexico, and when she decided to, cross over into, well, back then it was very different because you could move pretty, freely between the US and Mexico, but she ended up staying in the US and, getting sponsored by one of the families that she, worked for. She was a domestic like house cleaner, to be able to stay, to get a visa. And so she just told me everything, like all of these stories. And then when I told her that I was going to Mexico to live for a while, she just also was like, I'm just so proud of you. Like my parents were like very afraid. They were like, oh my God, don't go to Mexico, which is really weird because they're Mexican. But they were like, it's dangerous. It's this and that. Don't go. And my grandma's like, you're going to be fine. You're going back to the motherland. I'm so proud of you. Like, I wish I could go back there. And so she just was very encouraging, and came to visit me a few times while I was there, and just very happy, I think, to see that. in kind of her lifetime. And also, I mean, my kids who speak Spanish are the only great grandchildren who can speak Spanish to her. And so I think that also brings her a lot of joy that she's able to like communicate and know that they are still connected to the language and the culture, which means a lot to her.
Well, let's get to talking about language loss and how did you lose your Spanish?
Well, I think, it started back with my parents. So they grew up in South Texas and Spanish was their first language, only language. And they were also the first in their families to ever go to school. So they went to school in South Texas. And at that time in South Texas, or in all of Texas, there were like English only, rules and laws in schools. So you were only allowed to speak English. If you were speaking other languages at school, then you were punished and physically punished because corporal punishment was still then more prevalent, though I think it's still legal in Texas. And so that was, the reality. So that stance and reality for my parents also led them to believe that Spanish wasn't a valuable aspect for upward mobility. It wasn't a valuable tool for them to, go on to higher education or be successful. And they saw it, as you said, as like the home language, not the school language. And because it was a home language, they also didn't develop it in an academic way. Like they came to school with this incredible resource, and the school was like, no, that's not a resource. It's actually terrible. Keep it to the side and just focus on your English development. And so that's what they did. And I remember my parents would also complain because they're like, when we finally took a Spanish class, like in high school, we were like failing the Spanish class, like barely getting by because, we weren't literate in Spanish. We didn't know how to read or write it. And also the Spanish that they were teaching us was from Spain. So it was a different Spanish than the Spanish that we knew. And what we knew was, they told us was invalid, which I think also created an insecurity about their Spanish and if it was good enough. So when they had kids, they, had internalized this idea of assimilation and idea of English only as being the path to success. And all parents just want the best for their kids, including mine. So they decided that they were going to raise us just in English so that we would be academically successful. And they were also told by teachers at our school that, if bilingualism would confuse us, if they should just speak English to us because speaking Spanish to us would confuse us. And so that is what happened with us, is that we just grew up in a pretty English only environment, except that my parents still spoke Spanish with each other quite a bit, and especially when they didn't want us to know what was being said. And we were in a very Latino community, so we also like just heard it around us a lot in terms of, the markets we would go to, the restaurants. So it surrounded us a lot, but it wasn't something that we were actively using or developing. And I really didn't have an interest or see a value in it until I got to college. And started to learn more about my identity and history and culture, that I was like, oh, these things are actually assets. These things are good. And having access to the language is good. But that was never communicated to me in my, K-12 experience. And that's also a big part of why I became an educator, is because I was like, had I never gone to college and never been exposed to these ideas, I would have never known about the importance of my cultural and linguistic resources, and how it was good to preserve them.
What you're saying brings me back to the hierarchy of language, even in Spanish. Like European Spanish, like Spanish from Spain is very different, or and it's seen as more valued, more valid as like the Spanish from like my Puerto Rican friends that were using, and like they they will always be corrected, and it's like wait, it's very similar to African vernacular, academic like African English vernacular is very different than the academic English that we use, and teachers often, or I've seen like, oh, we don't use that, not gonna, it's going to, right? And so this like this hierarchy, like language, like schools is a place where language can become a political tool. And when you're what you're basically saying is like we really have to be careful. It's not just about teaching language because language is connected to identity, and when we politicize language, we politicize and demonize identities.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. If you say that language has no place in this academic environment, you're saying your culture, your identity, your come from has no place in this academic environment. And so it's deeply intertwined. And, I think a lot of, when you look at the historical perspective, like this, people knew this when they were trying to advance the idea of like an assimilated, country. This was an intentional thing. If you look at Native American boarding schools and the concept of like kill the Indian and save the man, their idea was like, let's strip people of their language. It was like, they are not allowed to learn that language. Anytime they speak that language, they're going to be beaten and humiliated, because we know that language is a connector to community and people and identity. And we want to take that from this community and assimilate them as quickly as possible. And so I think it's really important to look at exactly what you're saying as the politics of language and how that plays out in schools, and how we may be well-intentioned, maybe we're not thinking about that, but we're like, oh, that's not correct English, or that's Spanglish, or that's whatever, and we're beginning to deconstruct and criticize without understanding the larger political context and the implications for identity and sense of self and belonging, which also has implications for student learning.
Let's talk about the Language Preservation Project.
So we're a baby organization. We've been around for a year. And we essentially have two kind of flagship programs. We have our language preservation family collectives and our language preservation teaching collectives, which work across these two environments because, our systemically heritage languages have been kind of not developed or seen as deficits in school environments. And we can see that tide starting to shift. But there's been a legacy of harm and trauma that's happened in school environments that need to be repaired. And that's also leaked into, our home environments and what parents do, because parents just want the best for kids. So if we're going to heal this, it needs to be across both the home and school environment. So we work across those two settings, and we have kind of cohort-based models that we like to say decolonize language learning so that we can build bilingual children. And we go about bilingualism in a different way that's really centering a child's identity and culture to build a sense of belonging and motivation around their heritage language. Because if we know anything, like motivation is the number one thing that you need to learn: motivation, interest, and need. And so we really ground our approach to bilingualism in that. And we've completed 4 pilot programs in Asheville, North Carolina, 2 in Denver, Colorado, and 1 in Antonito, Colorado. And we're expanding to Houston next year. And right now, all of our programming is currently free. So we frequently, like in the communities that we're in, we will like send out calls for families and educators that are interested to sign up. So I would also say, if you're in one of those areas, definitely sign up. If you're not in one of those areas, you should still sign up, because it's very possible that we expand to a new geographic location and that we're also hoping to offer programmings there.
Let's go back to that topic of heritage language as an asset. Can you talk about why heritage languages are assets?
Well, heritage languages are like any language, an additional language, and we know the benefits of bilingualism really well, right? That bilingualism, it increases our empathy, increases our complex problem solving skills, increases academic performance, reduces risk of Alzheimer's. Like I could go on and on about the benefits of bilingualism. And heritage languages are like this special bilingual power because it's something that like gives you already a strong foundation for diving deep into bilingualism, because you probably have a lot of linguistic assets already in your home in terms of maybe you have family members that speak the language, maybe you have media around you that you're hearing in the heritage language, or books or cultural connections or lullabies. And so while for many, many generations, these heritage languages were demonized, because as we go back to kind of like, language prestige of maybe if you spoke French, that was great. But if you're speaking African American vernacular English, or you're speaking a Spanish from Mexico, that's not so great. So we're starting to shift that perspective and help families to see that this is a strength, and that this is something that should be cultivated and developed.
Can you tell us about your work and how you challenge this perspective?
So, our work challenges this perspective by kind of setting the grounding in helping folks to understand the history, that like we didn't just come up with these ideas that some languages are better than others just out of the blue, but it was something that's baked into our systems, that's baked into our policies, that we can see historically. And I think this historical perspective is really good because as heritage language speakers, sometimes we can internalize like shame around, oh, I should be able to speak this language better, or it's because my parents did this, or and really individualize it without understanding the bigger context. And so when you zoom out, you can say like, yes, there is a personal role in this, but you were working against this bigger system that was trying to extract these languages and cultures from you in the service of assimilation. So actually, even though you're looking at yourself maybe in a deficit-based perspective, what if you shifted that to a strength-based perspective and you saw all of the things that you were able to preserve and cultivate despite this systemic, approach to taking away language and culture in the US? And so that is really kind of the foundation of where we start in terms of helping families to understand the benefits of heritage languages.
So, would you tell us your perspective on raising multilingual children and your doctorate in the education?
Yeah, so I am raising three language. I was going to say three bilingual children, but that's the opposite. I'm raising two children with three languages. I don't have an extra imaginary child, so two children with three languages, and the oldest is 5 years old, and he speaks pretty fluently Danish and Spanish, and is emerging in English. And we're not worried about his English development whatsoever, because it's pretty good for 5, and we just know that he'll continue more and more to be exposed to English. And yeah, I mean, when I first started out in this process, I had a lot of doubts because I was not like Spanish was not my first language. It was something that I learned as an adult. It's not as strong as my English. Like I've been educated in English all my life. I have my doctoral degree in English. I know English really well. And when you learn a language later on in life, it can feel like you're always trying to like catch up with the vocabulary and the things that you don't know. And so when I was raising my son in those first months, it was really like a habit that I had to get into in terms of speaking the language to him, speaking to him exclusively in Spanish, because I wasn't used to speaking in Spanish all the time. And so I really tried to like build that habit in the house. And I remember this feeling of anxiety that I got when I left the house, because in the house I was like creating a language rich environment, and I was like, okay, ahorita vamos a cambiar ese pañal y tenemos que quitar este aquí, levanta la pierna, y narrando todo, ¿verdad? Like narrating everything to try to create a language rich environment. And then we went outside, and I was like mouth closed in New York City, because I was like, is that person a native Spanish speaker? Are they going to hear me talking and thinking, oh, wow, why is she speaking Spanish with that accent? Or like, it's not her first language, or did she conjugate that verb wrong? Or all these things. I had this fear of like not doing it correctly. And that was a huge barrier for me to get over, because I was like, oh my God, am I going to mess up my child? Am I going to do something wrong because I'm trying to raise him in this language that is not my strongest language? And then I thought about my mom, and I thought about this narrative that I had, that I was like, oh, I just wish that they taught me more Spanish, and I wish this and that. And it kind of shifted for me to be like, I'm actually grateful for everything that they did give me, that they gave me a passive bilingualism. They gave me a foundation of the language. They gave me an ear for the accent so that I could pick it up easier. And what they gave me was what they had, and it was enough. And I had to take on that perspective as a parent to say, whatever I give my son is what I have, and it's enough. And that strength-based perspective, I had to give to my mom and then give to myself and say, that's what I want my child to adopt, is to adopt a strength-based perspective. And that was really the foundation of how I could lean into multilingual parenting as a heritage Spanish speaker, as someone who learned the language later as an adult, to say, like, I don't want to pass on this like perfectionism to my child. I want to pass on a more liberated approach to language learning. I want him to know that accents are good. I want him to know that they're a sign of bravery, that you can speak more than one language. I want him to know that mistakes are okay and totally normal. I want him to know that with language, the goal is connection, right? So if you're able to connect, that's much more important than perfectionism and getting every conjugation right every time. And so when I got really grounded in like what I wanted to pass on to my son, not just with the language, but also the perspective of being a learner, it became much easier. And he's definitely adopted that perspective and is like, views himself as a language learner, and is like, at 6, I'm going to learn French, and just, thinks that language is fun and like a playground, and that, it's possible to learn all of these different languages. So that's what I would also recommend to families that maybe feel a little bit insecure about their language or insecure about their ability to raise multilingual children, that the mindset work is really important.
Here's what I wanted to ask. So you have a spouse who's Danish and you're Mexican American. Working in international schools, often the mother's language is not seen as prestigious as the father's language. So how do you deal with that? Because there is a Latin American culture in your family, Latin American slash U.S., but also there's a European culture, and your children go to a European or a Danish public school. So how do you deal with like the language hierarchy there?
Great question. And I see this definitely in Europe. I always point to Denmark as like a beautiful example of bilingualism, because they have like a fully bilingual population. It's just every child that grows up here is going to be bilingual Danish and English, like no question about it, which I think is a great example of how you can build a school system that cultivates that from a young age and consistently throughout the upper grades. But also in Denmark, they have a significant Middle Eastern population that maybe speaks Farsi or Arabic. And those languages, those home languages, are not viewed as valuable or as necessary of cultivating or growing. And we have, which is important, we're close to Germany, but we have classes, like languages classes in older grades in German and French, but there's not much in terms of the growing immigrant population here, or the heritage languages that are here, or teachers aren't, developing the capacity of like, even if you don't speak the language, you can still create an environment that cultivates the development of heritage languages and sees the strengths of these languages. And so I think I know you asked about my family in particular, but just in the larger context of where I live, I can see that language prestige and hierarchy play out in terms of what we see as a valuable second or third language and which languages aren't worthy or as valuable of developing or growing. And you can see even in some people of like which ones they might be comfortable with hearing around them. You're very comfortable with hearing English around you. But if you hear someone speaking Arabic around you, like the reaction may be different or more hostile. And so I think my perspective as an immigrant here, I'm like, my family they were immigrants in the US, and now I'm an immigrant in Denmark. And it's, hard. It's, I think, valuable to have that immigrant experience. It's hard, but I also come in as a very privileged immigrant because I have English as my language and not one of the more marginalized or looked down upon languages here in Denmark. So I just want to name that. And in terms of our family, I don't know that because we're not in an international like private school, we're in the public schools. I've not experienced that personally. I've not experienced like someone, saying that Spanish shouldn't be developed or that it's better that they use English or Danish. But it's also because I'm probably very like loud and out about what we're doing and who we are. And I'm like, just so you know who I am and what I do in terms of the teachers. And so I think they all know what we stand for. And we don't get that much kind of pushback about the language that we're using.
You said earlier that your husband speaks Danish to your children, and then you speak Spanish to them, and you don't worry about English. And so that's so fascinating. Why don't you worry about English development, even though you're an American?
Yeah, I mean, we don't worry about it that much. We do a different, like, we're very intentional about how we go about multilingualism. I think it's important to have a plan and to let that plan evolve over time. But when we started having children, we were like, okay, you'll be the, Danish speaker and I'll be the Spanish speaker, and we're going to speak English between us. And then at dinner time, we're all going to speak English together because that will be our time to like practice and develop English. We have some English books. They have some, we have some friends who have children who speak English. So we have some like intentional kind of exposure to English when we go back to the US. We're very intentional about Spanish exposure, but also some of his cousins or our children's cousins only speak English. So we have, intentional exposure to English as a language. But when we think about like what media we expose them to, like on Friday nights, we get to watch a movie and the movie is in Spanish, like almost all the time. If it's not in Spanish, then we choose English. And then if it's not in English, then we choose Danish because Danish is their strongest language, what they're exposed to most of the time. So we kind of have this hierarchy of like what languages they're exposed to, why and when. And we've had a conversation about that. And we've also had a conversation about what it looks like when they're older, because say we move back to the US, then everything's going to switch and Danish will become the most prioritized language at home because they will probably be in an English, Spanish, environment. And so when we watch media, it probably will always be in Danish, the books and things like that. And so it can shift over time. And I would encourage folks to think about language with that intentionality because learning it doesn't just happen through osmosis. There has to be some plan around it.
Bilingual expert Owen Cressfield, who wrote the book called Raising Bilingual Families, said that we have to have a family language plan. And you just gave a really beautiful, clear language plan. We're saying Danish is the most dominant language here, so we're going to prioritize Spanish. But when they go to America, we will also then switch back to Danish as the prioritized language because English will be developed in Spanish because they'll be at a bilingual program. I love that. Let's spend
Yeah.
the last 10 minutes talking about what schools and homes can do to create, to preserve students' heritage languages.
So, what can schools do to preserve heritage languages? I think the best thing that they can do is to have some type of programming in the heritage language. So, thinking about what does dual language programming look like, but that's not always possible because children come with so many different types of heritage languages that maybe you don't have the teachers that speak that language or enough students to be able to build a class around it. So I think it's also really important to have like a clear stance and mission statement, just like we have like, here's our equity statement or here's our mission statement, to have something in there about heritage languages and cultures so that everybody on your staff is really clear about the importance of it and how they go about supporting that mission statement. And I would also say, like, because this is a shift, because for generations, schools have actually not been a place that have cultivated heritage languages, that there should be some type of communication and orientation to families that says, like, welcome. And whatever language you have in your culture, in your community, in your home is something that we view as an asset. And here are ways that you can develop that and partner with us to ensure that your children continue to develop that. And I've seen some really great models in terms of like some school visits we did in Denver, where schools have like a family kind of home language project where they help families figure out a plan, like these family plans for continuing to develop heritage languages at home. So that's what I would say schools can do. I would say every teacher, no matter what language they speak, can create a culturally and linguistically affirming learning environment for children and help children understand that their culture and their languages are their strengths, and really create that environment. So everyone's involved. And then in terms of homes, for cultivating heritage languages, I would say that it really starts with like understanding the importance of it and shifting the mindset from deficit based, if it's there, to strength based, and developing a plan, like you said, of like how you're going to go about passing on this heritage language. And with the plan, I always like to start with families to think about what's your goal, because some folks may have the goal of, I want my child to like be able to go to university in this language and read and write and speak and everything. And other families are like, I want my child to be able to communicate to their grandparent in this language. And your plan is going to look very differently based on what your goal is. And then the last thing I would say for families around this is that though you have a plan and you have a goal, your child is your child and they're autonomous and independent. And just like you may have a plan that they're going to, be in the orchestra playing the piano and X, Y, and Z, you can create the environment for them to build those skills, but ultimately they get to decide what they want to do with those tools. And so they may decide, I'm not going to pick this up, or I'm not going to do this. And they may come back to it to a later point. So bilingual parenting, just like any form of parenting, is about releasing the grip on what the outcome is going to be and really just focusing on the process.
You're saying if you want to raise your children as bilingual people, um, partner with them.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout.
Yeah.
Let's spend the last 5 minutes talking about what teachers can do, because most of the people who are listening are just teachers looking for really clear strategies. You talked about teachers can create a language affirming environment. What are the things teachers should keep doing, should stop doing, and start doing?
Should keep doing. I think teachers should keep showing up every day and loving their children. Like every time I'm visiting a school, I just know, similar to parents, that they want the best for their kids, that teachers also want the best for their kids. So I would say keep doing that. And I know that schools, particularly right now after the pandemic, it can be a really like difficult place to navigate. So I would just say keep showing up for your kids. What they should start doing, I would take a really close inventory of your curriculum, your books, and your materials. So if you're wanting to create a culturally and linguistically affirming environment, take a look at your books. Do your books reflect the cultures of your students? Not only the cultures of their students, but the culture of the world? Do the books do you have books that show translanguaging? Do you have books that are maybe in English and Spanish or English and Tagalog, right? It can show a load of language diversity, even to a monolingual English student, so that they can show interest in the culture or in the language. And so I would take an inventory of your books, similarly of your curriculum, of how are you introducing different cultures and different identities and different languages to your students as an integrated part of what you do every day, and not just like the multicultural night at, school. So really thinking about how you do that. And similarly with the materials of like, what do the children see on the walls around them? What does the play area look like? What, everything that you have, ensuring that this is something that affirms their identity and humanity and the humanity of their classmates and students. So I said start and continue and stop doing. I maybe would say like stop doing. This is also from my experience, release a culture of perfectionism. Like so much we're like afraid to go into it and start because we're afraid that we might not do it right. But know that you're a learner, model that you're a learner alongside your students and narrate that for them. And I think really when you like show a playfulness with learning new things, that translates to your students as well, and they feel safer to dive into learning as well.
You mentioned earlier, this will be our last question. You mentioned earlier that you often go to schools in your work with them, and that means you must see so many different classrooms and how they're creating affirming language, uh, places for that affirm languages. Can you tell me, besides the books, um, can you share an example of a classroom that was like, whoa, you walked in and the way you saw the teacher interacting with students was like, yes, this is language affirming, even though the teacher didn't speak the languages that students represented?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say so. One of the communities that we recently worked in was like a majority white teaching force that didn't speak English, working in a majority immigrant Spanish speaking community. And the teachers started adopting and learning these affirmations for students in Spanish. And so the teacher started like starting their day with these affirmations. And I think even like modeling this little, like, releasing the culture of perfectionism of like saying these affirmations with students in Spanish as a way to start their day, even though the rest of the day is going to be in English, because that's the language that the teacher speaks, was a really powerful shift in power dynamics, shift in showing the value of that culture, and really just a beautiful sight to see of the children repeating these very affirming statements in Spanish.
Well, uh, Dr. Vero Benavides, muchas gracias para tu tiempo y for your wisdom and your compassion that helps children reclaim, families reclaim the connection to their language, which is a connection to their culture and their families.
Gracias a ti, fue un placer. It was a joy.